unwrapping the concept of self-mastery and what are the characteristics of women and men who demonstrate resilience, perseverance, the ability to see things through, who don't just start well, but actually finish well. And even in a very practical, everyday way, to talk about this dynamic of discipleship. What does it look like when a person becomes a fully mature follower of Christ? What does it look like to become a fully mature human being? And I think that sometimes we over-spiritualize the components to what it means to be a healthy human. And I cannot overemphasize the importance of prayer, of being in the scriptures, of living in community and being a part of a church community like Mosaic. All these are really vibrant and essential to your spiritual health. But what I really am focusing on is this dynamic of self-mastery. And we began by looking in the first session at the responsibility that all of us have for our lives, for our life change, that a fundamental characteristic of those people who find the resilience and have the resilience to face all kinds of circumstances and challenges is that they take ownership over their lives. And if I didn't say it clearly enough last week, without ownership, nothing will change. If you do not take ownership over your life, you will not see the change you hope for. You can pray for it. You can ask God over and over again. You can read the Bible as much as you want. You can go to church until they throw you out and close the doors. But if you do not take ownership over your life will not change. Now, over the last 20 years, there has been a growing field that has been researching our mindsets. It researches not only our mental health, but our mental resilience and the relationship of how we think to how we live. And this is so essential to our own spiritual health, to our own emotional, relational health. It's essential to every aspect of human experience. I know it doesn't feel like it, but everything that you do begins here. Everything you do begins in your brain. Everything you do begins in your mind. And not just everything you do, everything you are. I think it's interesting when we talk about different aspects of who we are with our physiology. I mean, you got to trust your gut, but your gut's kind of down here. And then you got to go with your heart, but your heart is real around here. And then you go, no, you got to think it through. Of course, your brain is up here. And so sometimes we seem to be so segmented between our gut, our heart, and our brain. But the reality is that our gut is actually right here in our brain, and our heart, it's right here in our brain. And the emotional center of who we are is not where our heart is. The emotional center of our soul, of who we are, is right here in our brain. So it's essential for us to understand and to realize that our mind is the entire territory of our essence, of who we are. And then we can talk about being left-brained or right-brained, or whether we're more logical or more emotional. But the reality is that we're this complex creation. And God has designed it in such a way that we even distinguish between our brain and our mind. And we know that every human being has a brain, but we also know we have a mind. And there's almost as much distinction between them as we would between the physical and the spiritual. But the reality is that it's all integrated. It's all interconnected. And the life you're going to live is going to have to be played out in the space between your ears. And the future you're going to create, it's going to be created in the space between your ears. And the spiritual maturity that you hope to attain, it's going to happen in the space between your ears. Because everything that God wants to do in your life is going to happen in the space of your mind. And so if you do not understand the mindsets that are shaping you, the constructs that are filtering in information and processing data and identifying and defining who you are as a human being, you will not understand how to move towards spiritual maturity. And in fact, it goes deeper than that. If you're a person of faith and you believe in the scriptures, then you know there's more going on than meets the eye. There's more than the physical world. There is this spiritual dynamic that's going on. In fact, the scriptures tell us that there is a war that rages all around us in this unseen reality. And how do we engage in that unseen reality? How does that unseen conflict between good and evil, between darkness and light, how does it engage us? Where do we meet that? Well, by the way, the territory in which that battle is fought is your mind. So you should never think of your mind as a non-spiritual place. You don't have a spiritual aspect of who you are and then a rational, logical aspect of who you are. Your brain space is the territory from which everything spiritual is fought and won or lost. In fact, in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5, Paul gives us this description of the battle in our mind. It says, "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ." Do you hear what he's telling us? Is that there's a war that is raging all around us, but it's also raging within us. And that war is actually happening in the territory of our minds. And that in this battle, there are arguments and there are battles taking place and weapons being forged to try to steal your mind. It says we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. So there are things happening inside of your brain right now that are the result of a war. And I think this statement is so, to me, fascinating, and it feels impossible to live out. It says, "For we take captive every thought to the obedience of Christ." Right? How in the world are we going to take captive every thought to the obedience of anyone? I mean, I don't know about you, but my mind is racing all the time. I have thoughts going through my mind all the time. Just not just dozens of thoughts or hundreds of thoughts. I have thousands upon tens of thousands of thoughts racing through my brain all the time. And some of them I give some attention to, and some I give a lot of attention to, and some I try to give no attention to, and they just keep flooding my brain. Have you ever felt like your brain has been inhabited by squatters? I mean, a lot of times I feel like somehow the territory of my brain left the gates open and thousands of other unwanted residents came in and just claimed the territory and said, we're going to stay here. And I hear all these thoughts and these ideas and these perspectives. And unfortunately, I have so many opinions about who I am. And I have all these voices in my head, and some of them seem to be for me, and some of them, by the way, seem to be against me. Some of them seem to like me, and some of them seem to really dislike me. Some of them believe in my future, and some think I have no future. And all these voices are raging inside of my brain, and I guess they're all me, right? I mean, aren't all these voices me? All the thousands of fragments of who I might be or am or think I am or want to become or I'm afraid I will become. How in the world do we take captive every thought to the obedience of Christ? If you have thousands upon thousands of thoughts flying through your mind, there's no way you can take these thoughts captive one thought at a time, one thought at a time, one thought at a time. And I think so many of us actually become exhausted because we try to fulfill the mandate of this declaration, trying to take captive one thought and one thought and one thought at a time. And then finally we just exhaust ourselves because there's just too many thoughts. And I cannot remember where it was, but I believe it was Robert Heinlein who once wrote about a character that he was driven to madness not because he could count the raindrops, but because he could count the spaces in between the raindrops. And And I read that when I was probably 10 years old, and I felt as if someone understood me because I felt I was being driven to madness because I could count the raindrops and the spaces between the raindrops. And, since that time, I became a part of that DNA project, 23andMe. And early on, they were able to give you a lot more information than I think they're allowed to give now. But um, they gave me all these pieces of genetic insight. And so I learned very quickly that I'm very unlikely to ever have Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. And I'm really grateful to know that. And that, but it's not anything I've done. It's just the result of the genetic makeup of who I am as a person. And it also said I'm very unlikely to ever be addicted to heroin and I guess that might come in handy, but it's never really been helpful to me in any way. And it lets you know things like, did I have like the genetic predisposition to be a super taster, and you discover all these different aspects. And one of the things I learned, of course, that I have a higher propensity toward being hyperactive, or to have attention deficit disorder, or to be OCD. But I did not need a genetic test to tell me that. And those were all pretty obvious just by living inside of my own skin. But I can tell you that there are times in my life where the thoughts were just racing through my brain so fast and so hard. And I would just sit in a fetal position in the corner of a room because I felt overwhelmed by the frenetic activity inside of my brain, and would do anything in the world to slow it down or to have some control over it. And so when the scriptures tell me I'm supposed to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, I honestly had to wonder, how could I take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ when I can't even take my every thought captive to the obedience of me? And then I'm on a journey towards self-mastery. And I realize that if I don't learn how to take control over my thoughts will take control over me. And by the way, that needs to give you pause. Because if you do not take control over your thoughts will take control over you. And you can know what your future looks like by where your mind is wandering. Our imagination has endless possibility. It can take us to so many places. We can imagine so many beautiful futures. We can imagine so many beautiful scenarios for life. We can imagine so much good, so much beauty, so much truth that we could begin to see a life we've never lived, a person we've never yet become, and a future that has not been created. And we can imagine it in our dreams. We can see it in our imagination, and we can almost begin to design it in the territory of our mind. At the same time, our minds can be fueled through such dark and negative spaces. We can be fueled more by fear than by faith, and begin to imagine the worst case scenario. We can imagine 1,000 ways that our hearts can be broken, or 1,000 ways that our dreams can be crushed, or 1,000 reasons why we shouldn't risk in love or risk in life. And if you're not careful, your imagination will paint a world so dark and so despairing that you'll be afraid to step outside when you wake up. But the human imagination really is God's gift to us, where we can construct a picture of our future self, of our future life, of a future world, and we can translate that imagination into reality. So we cannot take every thought captive by simply trying to stop what our brains are thinking. We have to take every thought captive by choosing what thoughts our brain will be thinking. And one of the things that is so extraordinary to me is that God has given us this capacity to imagine what does not exist. And that this space, this mind space, becomes the most powerful tool in the human experience. It should not surprise us that this is where the spiritual battle takes place. It should not surprise us that this is where every pretension against the knowledge of God is being set up and why we need to take every thought captive. This is where the war is raging because this is where the future is created. The battle is in your mind because the future is created from your mind. The battle is in your imagination because the future is created through your imagination. This is the territory from which the future is born. So, of course, this is the territory where the battle must be fought. But sometimes it feels that the battle is almost impossible to win because it's just one battle after another battle after another battle. And it doesn't feel like we're fighting lions. It feels like we're fighting bees. And, if you were just fighting one lion at a time, maybe you could find the courage to be David and go to war, to fight a lion or a bear or a giant. But you're not fighting a lion or a bear or a giant. You're fighting a swarm of bees, and they're coming at you thousands at a time. And you wonder, well, Jesus, can you help me with taking captive every thought? And this is why your mindset is so important. If you have a swarm coming at you, rather than trying to take each captive one by one, you have to learn how to redirect them and focus them and send them in the direction of your choice. That's where your mindset comes in. You have to begin to take control over the filter that shapes your thought. And as you begin to take control, take mastery over the filter of your thoughts, you'll begin to take control over the direction of your thoughts. One of the interesting passages in the scriptures that to me gives me an imagery for this kind of transition is in Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 22. It's during the life of Jesus, and a blind man comes to him, and we'll pick up here. It says they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man, and he begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside of the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, and by the way, this is not my preferred way of healing from Jesus. And Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people walking around like trees." Once more, Jesus put his hand on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Now, what I think is fascinating is that when Jesus heals this blind man, it happens in two stages. And this is one of those rare moments where there seems to be this almost like progressive healing. Jesus touches the man's eyes. And at first, when he has healing, it's not complete. He looks up and says, I see people. They look like trees walking around. I see men as trees. And several thoughts came to mind. One was, well, I wonder if this blind man had sight when he was younger because he could identify what he thought were trees and he could identify what he thought were people. So maybe he had a memory of trees. To say I see men as trees would give you some sense that he could identify a tree. But then I thought to myself, no, if you're blind all of your life, you would begin to create a construct in your imagination of what everything looks like. You would begin to touch people's faces and know how to identify them through touch, and you would create an image in your mind. And perhaps he had an image in his mind of what a tree was, but the moment he started to see, the images didn't match the reality of what was going on. I'm not sure what actually informed this transition, but what I do know is that even though Jesus touched his eyes, he could not see clearly yet. It said once more, Jesus put his hands in the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened and his sight was restored and he saw everything clearly. See, the goal of having a proper mindset is clarity. The ability to see life clearly. The ability to see yourself clearly. The ability to see choices clearly. When you have a healthy mindset, it gives you clarity about everything. And when you begin to have clarity, you begin to make the choices that create the future you long for. The other day, I was having a nightmare. Now, I have some fairly significant nightmares along the way, but a lot of my nightmares are really physical. I'm awake, I'm walking, I'm running, I'm talking, and my family's terrified. This was just a normal kind of generic nightmare. This was an everyday nightmare. And I remember the nightmare completely. I was standing about waist to chest high in a pond of water, and the water was murky, and I knew there were alligators in the water. And so while I was in the water and I'm sort of, dog paddling in the water, I'm trying to get my legs up because I don't want an alligator to eat me. And so I'm laying in bed and I'm throwing my legs up and throwing them off the bed because I'm trying not to get eaten. And then I had this moment of realization that I was not actually afraid of the alligators in the water. I was afraid of the fact that the water was so murky, I couldn't see through it. And I think most of us are actually not afraid of what's coming. We're afraid of the uncertainty. That the fear is actually the lack of clarity, that we can't see through this moment. We can't see how to get out of the situation. We can't see how to create the future we want. We can't see how to make this relationship work. We can't see how to find a job or get a job or keep a job. We are more afraid of not being able to see than even the fear we would have if we could see. And I sense at this moment for this blind man, can you imagine being in this transition where at first you could see nothing, but now you cannot see clearly? And I think that Jesus is letting us know that our journey towards sight is a process. That even as we come to him and we trust him with our lives, that a part of the journey is taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, learning how to take the murky water and make it clear. And if my understanding of water is close to being accurate, when water is stagnant, it becomes murky. When water has constant movement, it becomes clear. And that's why when you see a river that's moving without any restraint, the water is so clear, it's translucent, it's beautiful. And when you come on a riverbed where the water has become stagnant, it starts turning green and mossy and unclear. And I wonder if the reality is that the same is with our own souls, with our minds, that when we're stagnant, when we're not moving forward, when we're not trusting God, when we're not following him, that everything becomes murky and unclear. But when there's movement in our life and we're trusting God and we're following him where he leads us and we're moving forward in our lives, we become like this river that moves and the water becomes clear and we can see through. And there's so much beauty in that clarity. Is your brain murky? Your mind filled with fear and anxiety and stress? And do you hear voices all the time in your head telling you what's going to go wrong and how bad everything's going to go? And do you have these recurring thoughts that keep telling you who you're not or who you are in the worst of ways? I want you to realize that God does not want you to live in murky water. He does not want who you are being shaped by those voices that tell you you're less. I've had so many people over the years ask me, how do you hear God's voice and how do you know if it's God's voice? And I think it's a really complex question. But one of the ways I know that it's God's voice, and one of the ways I know that it's not God's voice is this. Every voice that calls me to less is not God. Every voice that tells me that I'm less is not God. The voices that fill me with fear, the voices that fill me with a sense of unworth, the voices that tell me that I don't matter, the voices that tell me that my future is not better than my past, the voices that tell me that I'll never be different, the voices that tell me I'll never change, I know those are not God. So the voices that reinforce my despair, the voices that reinforce my fear, the voices that reinforce my insecurity, the voices that reinforce my lack of worth, the voices that try to hold me in the past, those voices are not God. You need to pay attention to the voice that tells you that there's always hope. See, that's the voice of God. The voice that calls you to more, that's the voice of God. The voice that tells you you're going to change, you're going to be better, that life is going to be better, that the future must be better. That is the voice of God speaking to you. The voice that calls you to compassion, the voice that calls you to integrity, the voice that calls you to care, the voice that calls you to love, the voice that calls you to be the highest version of yourself. That's the voice of God. And that voice needs to be the structure within your own soul that creates the mindset from which you filter in what shapes your mind. Now we need to understand, even as Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 12, Paul says this. He says, "For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall fully know, even as I am fully known." So Paul admits that in this life, we're not going to see everything clearly, that right now, everything is still a little bit murky. We're only going to understand parts of the whole, and there'll be things in life that will remain uncertain and mysterious. But you're designed for mystery. You're designed to live in the uncertainty, because you don't have to know everything that's going to happen. You don't have to know how everything's going to turn out to live a life where you know that God is with you and that you're stepping into the calling that He created you for, and that you're creating the future that you've longed for. Because the uncertainty out there cannot control the certainty within here. So even if everything in the world is uncertain, when I have certainty about who I am, it changes everything. So if you're listening to me right now, and right now my words are resonating with you, and maybe it's because you keep hearing voices that tell you that you're never going to be good enough. You hear voices that tell you you're not worthy of love. You hear voices that tell you that you might as well give up on yourself. You hear voices that tell you there's no reason to live. But see, the moment you hear someone speak to you that is actually resonating with the voice of God to you, it starts to give you hope. See, the reason someone's words can actually bring so much meaning and hope, so much strength and courage to you, is that it is actually resonating with what God is saying to you right now. You will never move towards self-mastery until you take control over your mindset, until you realize that you are actually mandated to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And this can only happen when you choose the filter through which you allow thoughts to reside in your brain. You may not have control over the thoughts that pass through, but you have control over the thoughts that take root. Do not let negative thoughts stay in the universe of your mind. Do not allow them to build a house inside of your soul. When you hear your brain moving toward a negative thought, you need to send out a ballistic thought that says, I reject this thought. This is not who I am or who I will become. It doesn't match what God says. It is not in alignment with His words to me. And you need to be proactive in your thinking. This is why meditating on the scriptures is so important. This is why when you begin to allow the words of God to shape who you are, it begins to give you an internal strength, a will to create the life that God created you to live. If you want to understand what has given me the strength to live in the last 40 years as a follower of Christ, to fight through all the struggles and all the challenges and all the conflicts and all the battles and all the failures and all the disappointments, let me help you understand, just to give you a small glimpse inside of my own insanity. With all the thousands upon thousands and millions upon millions of thoughts that I feel like I've ever had to battle with, I finally decided I'm going to shape my mind on the thoughts of God. And I'm going to allow who I am to be defined by what God says about me. And I'm going to extricate from my mind, from the universe of my imagination, those things that are in violation of who God is and who God has created me to be. And when you take control over your mindset, you begin to erase the narratives that make you less, and you begin to write the story of who you will become. And those voices that were once so loud inside of your brain, they'll be forced to silence because they will not have the right to speak to you. Self-mastery begins and ends within. It begins by taking ownership over your life. And it begins by taking ownership over the construct of your mind, your mindset, to dwell on the good and the beautiful and the true, to think on those things that create the most good, and to refuse to give time and energy to every thought that would lead toward destruction. Eliminate every thought informed by bitterness or jealousy or envy or greed or unforgiveness or anger. Leave no room inside of the universe of who you are for those thoughts that would create the darkest version of you in the darkest world around you. And let those thoughts that are informed by all that is good and true and beautiful become the soil from which you dream of who you will become, the life you will live, and the world you will create. And watch how God will take your imagination and translate it into your reality. And if you're listening right now and you feel like you are out of control, that your thoughts have taken you over, they're controlling who you are, you're not controlling who they are. You know more than anyone right now that what you need is Jesus. Because I can tell you that when I finally trusted Jesus with my life, it was as if he came through with just a sweeper and just started cleaning out my mind from all the thoughts that were destroying me. And he began to use this beautiful whiteboard of my imagination and to write words I never knew could become me. And right now, if you're listening and you're ready to give your life to Jesus, to trust your life to him, to cross the line of faith, then I want to lead you in a prayer where you can open up your life to Jesus. Because the God who created you and the God who created your mind, the God who created your imagination, he wants to meet you there and teach you how to dream of a better you and a better life and a better world. So if you're ready to receive Jesus right now in your life, would you just pray this prayer with me right now? Jesus, I give you my life. Right now, just tell him, Jesus, I give you my life. Jesus, I give you my life. If this is your prayer, if this is your desire, in this moment, the God who created you has come to meet you. And I can tell you that Jesus has come to dwell within you, and the God who created you and the God who died for you and the God who loves you, he now lives within you. And he'll never leave you or forsake you, that today is the beginning of a new you and of a new life. And I just want to welcome you. And by the way, you can't even begin to imagine what God's going to do with you. it's going to be a beautiful thing. And if you've given your life to Jesus, one of our pastors is going to come in just a moment and guide you in how to take your first steps. Because following Jesus is a journey. It's a journey you should never take alone. And I want to welcome you to this beautiful family that Jesus is creating all over the world. And what binds us together is his love. Welcome to Mosaic, and we'll see you next week.